Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us at today's panel. This panel is a part of our international conference, Great Power Competition, a challenge to the rule-based order. And this panel is focused on Taiwan and Taiwan's security challenges and prospects, and what's the US policy towards Taiwan. So without taking time, I would like to invite Mr. Edmund Harty to moderate the panel. And before I handing him over to Edmund, I would like to announce that the views expressed and presented here are personal, should not be constituted to any organizations and any institutions. Thank you for joining us. Edmund, over to you.
Thank you. So Dr. Hanmin Yao is currently the Director and Associate Professor of the Graduate Institute of International Security at College of International and National Defense Affairs at the National Defense University in Taiwan. Dr. Yao received his PhD from the Department of International Politics at Aberystwyth University in Wales, United Kingdom. His research investigates the intermingled relations between national security policy, international relations, and technologies. He's contributed to various book chapters in defense policy and strategic development, coordination between Japan and Taiwan, middle power responses to China's BRI and America's Indo-Pacific strategy, transformation of geopolitics, security turbulence in Asia, shaping new strategy in Japan and Taiwan, and the Handbook of Asian Intelligence Cultures. His other work can be seen in National Interest, Issues and Studies, Journal of Cyber Policy, Korean Journal of Defense Analysis, International Journal of Taiwan Studies, and Mainland Affairs Studies. Dr. Malcolm Davis is a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, where he works on space policy, how technology will shape future warfare, and Chinese military modernization. He holds a PhD in strategic studies from the University of Hull and completed postdoctoral research on China-Western relations with the Faculty of Society and Design at Bond University from 2012 to 2016. He worked for the Australian Department of Defense in a variety of capacities from 2007 to 2012, and was a lecturer at the Joint Services Command and Staff College in the United Kingdom from 2000 to 2007. Ms. Purnima Vijaya is a PhD fellow at the Jindal School of International Affairs in Sonepet, India, where she is studying Southeast Asia and China. She's currently working as a research analyst at the Nanking Pao Kipkin Center for Southeast Asia Studies. She earned her master's degree in international studies and comparative politics from Christ University in Bangalore. Her recent work discusses the new normal in Asia following the COVID-19 pandemic and Australia's role in the Quad and its relationship with China. These will be our panelists for tonight's discussion. All right, so to get us started, I want to start off with a question about the US's recent efforts to stifle China's semiconductor industry and whether it changed the long-term security and economic landscape of US-China competition. And if you have any opening remarks on the issue more broadly, please feel free to begin with those. Dr. Yao, would you like to begin?
Okay, thank you, Emma. Originally, I prepared, slides, and it was talking about the more hard security issues because the panel has been, centered on the Taiwan, the US and Taiwan security, and also the prospect and challenges. But I received the email this morning, and I think it looks like we should go through all these questions and then talk about what we think about. So I guess you referred to the recent semiconductor competition between China and US, and as you said, to extend recent effort to stifle China's semiconductor industry can change the long-term security and economic landscape, right?
I'm sorry, may I interrupt you, Yao? Dr. Yao, if you have the presentation, please go ahead with your presentation, and then we can take the questions. So, okay.
Okay, so just to be clear, originally I thought you'd be like everyone, just give their talk, and then we move on to talk about all these questions. So that'll be the correct proceeding, right?
Yeah, so we will go with the initial remarks and then we will take the questions, right?
Okay. So, yeah, thank you, Dr. Indu. And in that case, I just go directly to my presentation. Okay, I want to make sure if everyone can see my screen.
Yeah, sure, we can see it.
Okay, good morning and good evening. So, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Hongmin Yao, and I'm currently based in Taiwan. I'm the director of the GIIS in NTU Taiwan. And well, I need to say thank you to Dr. Gerald McKinney's invitation, although he has other important business tonight. And I also want to say thank you to Dr. Indu, to your organization for your wonderful organization, the Consortium of the Indo-Pacific Researchers. Thank you for your arrangement for the event. I would like to just, maybe serve as the foundation for the discussion, since the panel is talking about the US and Taiwan security and prospect and challenge. So I would like to just, focus on this. By starting talking about, well, everyone knows in August, after the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, China react, strongly by conducting military exercise over Taiwan Strait. In fact, many of you probably be aware, this is not the first Taiwan Strait crisis. This is the fourth one. The first one was in 1954 to 55, when China seized two Taiwan Control Island, Yijiangshan Island and Dawson Island. And that's the first Taiwan Strait crisis. The second one was in 1958, when China conducted military bombardment at the offshore island owned by Taiwan, that's Kinmen. And the third one was in 1995 to 1996, when then Taiwanese President Lee Teng-hui visited US. And, so the POA conducted military exercise on this green shaded area. And the latest one was in just this year, after Nancy Pelosi's visit, the scale and the intensity of the military exercise has been increased. The main point I want to talk about today is like originally in the beginning, it looks like all these military exercises are more like a political message. But my argument is nowadays, these military exercises originally look political in the first place. They are actually with the military intention. People who are concerned about the Taiwan security and also the Northeast Asia security understand Taiwan militarily is located in the first island chain, and economically, Taiwan is very important area, and it provides the economic foundation for the region. We've been talking about the semiconductor, that's certainly part of that. And politically, Taiwan also stands as the forefront between the value between democracy and autocracy. So I would say this is more like the external perspective. But I think my talk here is to bring you some kind of local perspective. So it's better that we pay attention to some of the nuances that we very often ignore. In fact, when we say Taiwan, we are only referring to the Taiwan proper. And Taiwan also owns other offshore islands like Penghu, Kinmen, Wuqiu, and Mazu. So this is Chinese coastline. So the reason I want to bring you back to this point is because when Chinese militaries and vessels are moving around the west of the median line and even on the median line, for us, it's actually conducting some kind of provocative action, since they are actually they are activating in the east of some of our offshore islands. And that's the reason we are very vigilant. So this is the first point I want to point out. Very often we're only talking about Taiwan by itself, but we also need to pay to the nuances of the other offshore island owned by Taiwan. The second thing is about China's ambition. The debate is also about, is China's assertive behavior in recent years is more like a responsive action, or is more like responsive action to external factors, or more like some kind of the endogenous decision or ambition. And I want to bring you back to the history. In fact, when I joined the military back to 1990s, I saw with my own eyes most of the Chinese military exercise and activities are constrained within the coastline of the China. And that was back in 1990. And because I pointed out there are offshore islands owned by Taiwan over here, so there seems to be a tacit agreement between Taiwan side and the Chinese side that both refrain its military activity. But since change after the first time, the second time, the third Taiwan Strait crisis, when our then President Lee Teng-hui visited the U.S., and then by year 2000, the first change of the administration in Taiwan from KMT administration to DPP, PLA military activities has been expanded to the west of the median line. And during this period of time, even by 2008, when we had another change of the administration from DPP to KMT, although the cross-strait relation was relatively stable, but China continued to intensify its military activity to the west of the median line. By 2013, if you remember, the East China Sea ADID, the South China Sea dispute, island buildings, and by 2015, China unilaterally proclaimed a controversial airway, M503. And if the reason I want to put everything on map, you can see here are Mazu, Wuqiu, Kinmen owned by Taiwan. And they are, drawing civilian airways to the east of these offshore islands. So I think the facts speak for itself. What I try to pointing out is like we have been saying that China is responsive to the regional situation, but a local perspective, specifically in Taiwan, is China is actively shaping the regional security structure. That would be something I want to pointing out. By 2019, all of these are all in public domain. China conducted some kind of long-haul training to in between the first and second island chains, and this is where we are now, 2022. They, in protest to Nancy Pelosi's visit, not only to the west of Taiwan, they conduct the rocket. They use the multiple rocket launchers and conduct exercise over here. They use ballistic missiles to conduct the fire drill to the north and the south of Taiwan, and they also dispatch their naval vessels close to the Taiwan adjacent areas. The intention is to shape a new normal, but the strategy is very complicated. Certainly, they use the hard military to conduct their military exercise, but along with the disinformation, the spread of the fake pictures, cyber attack, dispatch of the UAV into Taiwan's offshore island. Their strategy is to spread threat, making sure people in Taiwan feel the PLA's presence and the military threat. So that's basically the first section of my my talk, more like giving you some kind of the security context. The major point I want to say is certainly because we have been talking about gray zone, salami slicing, and you can see there's a clear trend over layer, and we can see it's more like some kind of incremental coercion upon Taiwan. Now I want to move to the second bit because to facilitate our discussion, the dialogue for the U.S. and Taiwan security, and even talk about the prospect and challenges, I think it's important to illuminate potential conflict over Taiwan's trade, and by thinking about what's happening in Europe right now. So I quickly draw some points that I think we can do the comparison, and just by looking at them, maybe we can talk about what could be the prospects in the future. The first one, if you do put the map, Taiwan, China, and Ukraine, Russia on the map, we can see there are similarities. Well, but there are also differences. So the first one is about border. So Ukraine shares a very long border with Russia. So Russian tank can just go straight to the Ukraine territory. But Taiwan is an offshore island. Certainly this geographical feature create the problem for China to overtake Taiwan. But from the Russian-Ukrainian war, we also understand the importance of the satellite intelligence, Hence, in the future, I believe the intelligence cooperation will be something very important in preparation for defending Taiwan. Second, in terms of the economics, Ukraine's GDP in 2020 is about 155 million US dollars, and Taiwan is about 5 times of that. It's about 700 billion US dollars. And Ukraine's economy style is relying on the export of the agriculture and natural resources, but Taiwan's economy is highly connected, not just to the region, but also to the world. But to having said that, China is ranked number 2 in terms of the GDP. Certainly, a future conflict would involve the economic warfare, and I think that has been signified by Edmund's first question. Now, in terms of the line of the communications, Ukraine serves as a land bridge connecting Russia and Europe, and certainly a lot of talk has been focusing on the energy securities. But Taiwan's location, not just militarily, is important in the first island chain. Its surrounding areas are also important sea line of communications for the trade to Korea, Japan, to Southeast Asia, and most importantly, even to China itself. So I guess we have been talking about strategic clarity or strategic ambiguity. I was thinking about, given that China already believes that any future conflict in the region will involve US military. And hence, China has already developing, we all know that anti-SS area denial capabilities. So this might help us to think about exactly what's the validity of the debate in terms of the strategic clarity and ambiguity, given that China already believes that certainly external force will get involved. The so-called external force will get involved. Now, let's talk about strategic assumptions. Russia changed its strategic assumption a couple of times. Prior to April, it was attacking Kyiv and it was attacking Ukraine from multi-fronts. In terms of military, we always say you need to centralize your military attacking enemy's center of gravity. So obviously, prior to April, Russia was not doing that, and they did not assemble enough, force to attack Ukraine. I think it was about the same size, about 200,000 military personnel. But China is learning from this. So China has always said that any conflict in the region will be quick and decisive. I think this will answer indirectly to I skimmed through Edmund's question list. Is China going to attack the offshore island or going to attack the Taiwan proper first? That also helped us to think about that. And certainly for Taiwan, its strategy is also very important. We need to prolong the war like what Ukraine has been doing. Now, in terms of the logistic, Russia and China is different. In the biggest thing is like China is the war factory. So we understand Russia had many difficulties in terms of its war engine due to the sanction. But when the future, war occur in the East Asia, certainly China's domestic military civil fusion capability will play a very important role. And then let's move on to talk about the homeland defense. I guess this is also something that's been discussed quite a lot. Actually, we have been admired for Ukrainians' homeland defense force, and they've been helping the country and the government to defend themselves. And back to the end of last year, Taiwan actually took the initiative to set up a new agency. It's called OR Defense and Mobilization Agency. But I guess what distinct from Taiwanese way of thinking from the Ukrainian way is Ukrainian treat the homeland defense, different from the regular military. And Taiwan right now is going through this debate. We were thinking treating our reservists as the extension of the regular army. But some people argue, given that they are playing some kind of supporting role, maybe we should train them and equip them differently. And certainly, this is an ongoing issue, and it will be something that we need to pay attention on. The last thing is the political leverage. The Western sanction, as I mentioned, probably didn't have the direct effect to change Russia's decision making, but it has its capacity to slow its war engine. But for China, it probably would be less about slowing its war engine, keeping its war factory, but it still has the capacity to change Chinese Communist Party's members' decision making. Given that Chinese Communist Party always want to harness different kind of the tools to maintain its legitimacy, from economic tool to recently after 20th Party Congress, he seems to harness ideological tool. So certainly this will be something that we need to consider in the future. Lesson and implications. There are many things we can talk about. I want to just focus on 4 aspects. Legal warfare will play a very important role, like Russia's invasion upon Ukraine. Russia has been proclaiming that there was some kind of humanitarian crisis in the east of the Ukraine, around Donetsk and Luhansk. And Russian staged some kind of referendum to legitimize its proclaim. Likewise, in the future conflict, China will certainly do the same thing to proclaim this is a domestic internal affair and there should be no external interference. But I think this argument is problematic in the way that the UN Charter 2.3 emphasizes all member states need to settle their dispute by peaceful means. And Article 2.4 always say that member states should refrain in their international relations from the threat over the use of the force. Taiwan is not a member of the UN, but China is. This is certainly the point I want to point it out. And the other thing is, I think back in 1974, the UN passed the resolution 3314, which is specified the definition of the aggression. But I'm not talking about the definition of aggression. There's a specific thing mentioned in the this resolution. It says, in this, as I quote, definition, the term state is used without prejudice to Christian or recognition, to Christian of recognition or to whether a state is a member of the United Nations. So certainly any future use of the China's use of force upon Taiwan is not because international law give China legitimacy to do so. It's simply Chinese Communist Party's leader like Putin prioritize its political ambition over the regional stability. The second one probably will happen over Taiwan Strait crisis, similar to Russo-Ukrainian war, is the media warfare. We understand, Russia understands the importance of create a strategic narrative to project its value upon Ukrainian people, matter Christian, what kind of people they are, what state they are. They monopolize Slavic culture. And likewise, the similar strategy will be used by Chinese Communist Party to monopolize Chinese culture. As I mentioned, if you check the 20th Party Congress, China now is talking about, China is talking about Taiwan is the synthesization and promoting incremental independence. And I think, as I mentioned, Chinese Communist Party is always concerned about its political survival. You will harness any kind of tools, either its economic tool or ideological tool. And so China right now is turning ideological, and Xi Jinping has been calling the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So this is certainly something going to be similar in the future. And one sign I want to mention about, there's also talk in Taiwan right now. I know during Russo-Ukrainian war, Ukrainian was able to use Starlink to continue the communication. But given that we mentioned about any future conflict over Taiwan Strait, certainly will involve economic warfare. And this would make us, for those private sector that have the huge business interest in China, to what extent they will be able to provide the same level of support upon Taiwan. So this move on to the economic warfare. This doesn't mean that economic warfare is in favor of China. We should always remember for the past 10 to 20 years, Chinese Communist Parties has reframed this economic development to facilitate its political legitimacy. originally the West was thinking about by doing the economic engagement, we could encourage China to have some kind of a domestic, a more moderate voice, and eventually encourage democratizations. But Chinese Communist Party's propaganda apparatus has been able to reframe this. So for me, I'm thinking about interdependence is a weapon for China, but it's also a soft belly for the Chinese Communist Party as well. I know my time is limited. Let's move on to talk about the military operation. There have been a lot of implications we can learn. Number one is about the Homeland Defense Force, the timing for the mobilization. They've been always talk about, Ukrainian didn't mobilize in military quick enough. And there was also about the intelligence sharing, the intelligence cooperation between Ukrainian and other countries. Likewise, for Taiwan, it will be the same. And I guess what has been talked about quite often right now is talking about should Taiwan pursue a porcupine strategy, or are we already doing a porcupine strategy? What I want to emphasize is more like whatever analogy we are putting over here, eventually this porcupine strategy, we need to think about the length of the needles, because porcupine would defend itself, by presenting its needles. And as I say, Taiwan is an island, and our defense policy also always emphasizes that we need to resist the enemy on the opposite shore, to attack it at sea, and destroy enemy in the littoral area, and annihilate enemy in the beach area. So the debate now is more like, are we doing a asymmetry, developing a symmetric capability, rely on more portable weapons, or should we develop some kind of the long-haul capability to strike the enemy within their territory? What we learned from Ukrainian, this is probably my opinion only, the portable missiles are only useful for the within the line of sight operation. But think about the situation of the Taiwan Strait. If we do not have any kind of the long-range capabilities, how will we be able to deal with the beyond line of sight threat? And then if Taiwan also is a small island, when war occurs, will Taiwan become a stuffed porcupine? So hence, emphasizing the need of the developing homegrown defense industry is also something that has been discussed right now. Well, I reached the end of my talk. I want to quickly talk about the prospect and challenges. My talk I want to emphasize is this China under Xi is different from the China before. Deng Xiaoping emphasized a foreign policy of the keeping a low profile. But Xi Jinping right now is talking about striving for achievement. So we can't think about the current security strategy based on the old assumption. And likewise, as I mentioned, the Chinese Communist Party, the current one, is exploiting any kind of tool to maintain its political legitimacy. Hence, I think we need to do some kind of surgical or acupuncture information operation. We need to focus center on our message regarding the Chinese Communist Party, because Chinese Communist Party certainly would like to create some kind of ready around the flag effect. And this will be something I want to mention. The second thing is about the deterrence. I think China right now is having an expansionist agenda. Hence, our best strategy for deterrence is to change its perception. A lot of people has been arguing that if we are investing our defense, we provoke China. But we always need to be careful about the causation claim. It's because China already have the expansionist agenda, then we need to change its perception. It's not because we want to change its perception, then we provoke its expansionist agenda. This is also the point I want to emphasize. Based on these assumptions, more defense industry cooperation is needed, as I mentioned, to prevent Taiwan from becoming a stuffed porcupine. More intelligence sharing are needed. and we should deepen more further cooperations. And in terms of the challenges, I have 2 points. The first one is certainly from the Russo-Ukrainian war, we observe NATO as the regional security governance institution was able to mobilize its resources and constantly supporting Ukraine. And so far, there is no security governance institute in the Northeast Asia. This is certainly something very challenging. And the last one, probably everyone in the room knows, Taiwan's ambiguous international status become an easy spot for China to exploit. And this is certainly something that is very important. We need to be aware in terms of this regional security context. To conclude,
Dr. Hornman, just I am interrupting you. We will take this in the question answer. So maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So I'll stop here. I want to say that to stabilize region, we need to have a collective effort, and that is something I want to emphasize. And thank you, Dr. Indu, and thank you for you. This is what I want to say, and we can continue the dialogues. Thank you, and hope to see you guys in Taipei.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Carmen Yao. Would our panelists like to, if you have any opening remarks of your own, please feel free to present them. Otherwise, if you have any questions or anything you want to interact with Dr. Yao on, that would be fantastic. Anything you want to add here before we move into the more directed Q&A session?
Please go.
I think Dr. Yao gave a really good presentation. So I had actually planned to do a presentation, but then I got the list of questions, so I assumed that that's what we were doing. So look, all I will say is that from an Australian context, we are now looking at how the China-Taiwan scenario is emerging, and it is fundamentally reshaping our defense policy. We've now gone to the situation whereby we're no longer assuming that we have 10 years warning of a major power war, and we are recognizing the challenge of a rising China, and particularly within the context of a Taiwan scenario. And I think the US is doing exactly the same thing. And there's a lot of discussion about so will the Chinese move against Taiwan later this decade? There's various different dates thrown about. I think that from my perspective, the greatest period of risk is probably between 2024 and 2027. 2024 being the Taiwanese presidential election and the US presidential election, 2027 being the 100th anniversary of the PLA, and also the date for the next party Congress. So Xi Jinping has been brought to power with an expectation that he will deliver Taiwan to China. And if he fails to do that by 2027, then his credibility and his influence will start to wane, and he could actually be overthrown. So from Xi's perspective, there's a personal agenda here to basically take Taiwan. Secondly, from a military technological perspective, I think the longer that the Chinese wait to do an operation against Taiwan, the greater the risk is that they will fail, because after 2027, 2028, the US and its allies, including Australia, start to get the sorts of military capabilities that could actually blunt any Chinese anti-access and air denial capabilities, and also make any cross-straits invasion far more costly. So there's every incentive, I think, for Xi and for the PLA to do an operation against Taiwan sometime within this decade, rather than waiting until the 2030s or even longer. And in that sense, that's shaping defense policies in the region. I think Japan is starting to come on board in terms of its willingness to work with the Americans in a Taiwan crisis. Obviously, we are starting to reshape our defense policies in anticipation of that crisis, and the phone call that we get at 2 a.m. in the morning from the president basically saying we need Australia on board under the ANZUS agreement. I think it's inconceivable that we would say no to the Americans at their greatest time of peril when they go basically into harm's way in support of Taiwan. So, and if you look at the American side, you've had Biden now basically say, we will support Taiwan 4 times. And now each time that the White House has walked back his comments. But I do think that suggests that there is at least a debate and a discussion occurring in the US strategic policy community to the effect that, you know, we should be ending strategic ambiguity and moving beyond that to some sort of more declared visible posture, purely to deter China from taking that action, but if deterrence fails, to be more effective and ready to defend Taiwan. So in summary, I don't want to belabor this point, but I think things are building up to a climax here in the latter half of this decade. I think you will see between now and 2027 increasing Chinese coercion in the gray zone, more of these missile tests, greater threats to Taiwan's offshore territories, more use of blockade tactics, and greater economic and cyber coercion. But ultimately, you know, taking some offshore islands doesn't give Xi what he needs, which is Taiwan. So I think that what you will see, probably by in the second half of this decade, is an escalation to an eventual crisis of a cross-straits invasion. And then it will be a case of the United States, Japan, Australia, potentially others, working together to try and defeat that invasion. CSIS ran a series of war games in Washington, D.C., which showed that the US could potentially hold off the Chinese, but at great cost in terms of lives lost and platforms lost, including 2 aircraft carriers. And likewise, I think the Chinese would take a bloody nose in any contest between the US and China over Taiwan. But from China's perspective, they must take Taiwan. And so therefore, they're not going to give up even if they take heavy losses. From the US perspective, they cannot afford to allow China to take Taiwan, because if they fail to stop them, then US strategic credibility is on the line with the rest of the region. And China would move much more aggressively, having taken Taiwan, to challenge areas such as the Ryukyus in Japan, or more aggressively in the South China Sea. So there is that risk, I think, of 2 things coming out of this crisis. The first thing is protracted war. Rather than a short, sharp conflict, it would last months, potentially longer, of high intensity war. And the question then becomes, the experience given in Ukraine, how can Western democracies sustain military readiness and military capability to undertake high intensity operations over a period of months, given our effectively our poor ability to produce munitions, including sophisticated long-range guided missiles, quickly. The second point, of course, is the risk of escalation across the nuclear threshold. We're facing that in Ukraine now. It's still an open question as to whether we get out of this conflict without nuclear weapons being used. But I think we'll face the same question going in regards to Taiwan, whether the conflict could escalate across the nuclear threshold, and how do Beijing and the US manage that situation. So that's my thoughts. I did have a presentation, but it kind of like got pushed to the side when I got the questions, but that's the summary of it, essentially. Thank you.
Dr. Davis, that was very helpful too. And I think that focusing in on the timeline questions and how things have essentially changed, and bringing in Dr. Yao's point about the 20th Party Congress and China's new ideological weapons, I think we've got some interesting synergies there for what that would mean for deterrence and the prospect of successfully resisting an invasion. So I look forward to doing some follow-up on that a little bit later in the conversation. Ms. Vijay, do you have a follow-up that you'd like to do with the panelists before I ask my questions, or do you have a presentation of your own?
I actually prepared a presentation of my own. Could I just go ahead?
Sure, by all means.
Is my screen visible?
Yes.
Yes.
You can see.
Oh, great. So I was just considering the topic that we were discussing. I was just going to look into the enhancing of deterrence and what it would include. So we know that the cross-strait tensions have escalated to new levels in 2021, and in response to increasing pressures from China, US has taken several numerous steps, including like calling it rock solid partnerships that you see today. However, it is very crucial to analyze, what are the military and the non-military measures to deterrence here, because Taiwan question does not only cover the military aspects of it, it also includes non-military deterrence, which will include aspects like digital infrastructure and supply chain resilience and cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. So basically, the presentation will follow along the lines of looking into what steps can Taiwan take, what are the synergies between US, Taiwan, and the allies, US allies in the region. So deterrence definitely takes military options, and key enhancement to deterrence will include, like I said, a combination of such military and non-military deterrence. And looking closely into Taiwan's military deterrence, like it was already said, is what they follow is known as porcupine strategy. Despite the improvements to the strategy and the effectiveness since history, the advancement to such capabilities in air and defense missiles or naval mining and interoperability still has scope for certain improvements in order to better equip themselves in deterring the Chinese threat. In the context of Taiwan, with respect to cyber harassments and keeping the defense grid and the population as well resilient, non-military options also become extremely essential. Having said that, I'll come back to this when we talk about cooperation and the allies. But having said that, monitoring aggressor motivations is also key to deterrence. And we have already discussed that, China has been escalating over, especially the last 1 year. And recent studies have also shown that aggressor motivation is key to governing deterrence. Aggressor motivation simply implies how urgently does someone feel the need to act. And while until recent times, people were saying that, scholars were saying that the deterrence possibilities and the seriousness of aggressor motivations were still not as imminent, but then in the last couple of days, we can see that changing with new and recent developments. Following which, I just have to say that today, not only Taiwan, US, and the allies all have to contemplate their role in deterrence in the Strait. Considering the challenges to US hegemony in itself and the military preparedness, as mentioned, that in war games, it's going to be extremely costly despite their involvement. Criticisms and questions have also been raised on, how timely or on the timeliness of their decisive and precise weapons delivery mechanisms. So considering all that, the critical infrastructures is also being criticized and being questioned from the United States. So coordinated, like mentioned before, coordinated deterrence measures is going to definitely help Taiwan in answering and deterring China. Finally, I just want to say that including non-military actions and Taiwan in bringing in allies like Japan and Australia and using the southbound policy and connecting to the Indo-Pacific region and creating new defense partnerships and using various areas of cooperation such as defense and economic and diplomatic and cultural. All of that is going to only increase the interest, expectations of all the players involved in the region. And that's about it. In the final conclusion, I just have to say the same thing, that difficult conversations for allies, because considering that Japan and Australia and countries in the region still have to contemplate on the strategic circumstances in consequence to considering and recognizing China as an adversary, so that they don't face devastating consequences of the same. So a lot of those discussions has to happen, and those difficult conversations has to happen now, considering the intensity of the escalations. Thank you.
Thank you. That last point about the conversations that we had about the different interests of the various parties, I think that ties in quite well on both questions, deterrence, and then how would a war between the U.S. and China over Taiwan and the coalition, how would that end? How could that be negotiated? So I look forward to tying that in again as well. To interact a little bit, going back to Dr. Yao's presentation. I have a question for the three of you about how the recent party Congress and any changes in power structures and any changes in balancing against Xi, how does that affect how you view the coming conflict, and whether whether it changes China's strategic calculus about what level of risk it's willing to take, what level of cost it's willing to suffer, and whether Xi has the prerogative or the flexibility to take actions that would not necessarily be in the CCP's broader interest, but be perhaps more aligned to his narrower personal interest for his own legacy, and what that would portend for the prospects of war, and what level of deterrence would be required to prevent a conflict. So any of you that want to take that point from there and address that would be fantastic.
Look, let me jump in. I think that what we are seeing with Xi getting a third term, essentially becoming president for life, is he's determined to become absolute ruler of China, and I think even eclipse Mao Zedong in terms of being the leader or the helmsman of China. And in that regard, he cannot afford to be seen to fail in terms of taking Taiwan. I refuse to use the word reunification because the CCP never controlled Taiwan. So I think that what you are going to see is Xi moving the PLA or exhorting the PLA to move faster in terms of modernization and closing the gaps in terms of capability where they need to address lost capability or capability deficiencies, so that by the second half of this decade they are more ready, so that Xi can come to the next party Congress with essentially having claimed victory in Taiwan. Now, there's no guarantee he's going to get that. The invasion could fail, it could lead to a much wider war, which I think is likely. It could lead to even nuclear escalation, but he will to not try, to do nothing, and to watch Taiwan increasingly slip into a greater international role with greater relations with other countries. With the US sort of building up its relationship with Taiwan and so forth would be literally a fatal mistake for him. So I think that what you will see is it's in Xi's interests, and therefore it's in China's interests, and that's how he sees it. Okay, and the way that Xi is controlling the popular narrative in China now is that the people, at least the party, will go along with whatever Xi wants. Obviously, there could be internal uncertainties. I think that's why you saw Hu Jintao bundled unceremoniously off the stage to send a message to anyone who dares to oppose Xi that this is the fate that awaits you. The interesting question in my mind, though, is it's not so much about Taiwan, it's about how Xi manages the numerous domestic challenges within China, including things like COVID and weakening economic growth and so forth, that could actually undo him. But in a way that also makes him more dangerous because he's more likely to lash out if he's being threatened at home. I'll stop there.
Well, if I may, I want to kind of cut in and support Dr. Davis' comment in general. I think Dr. Davis mentioned about the most dangerous time could be found 2025 to 27, and it's also because that's the end of his third term and also the 100 year of the establishment of the PLA. Now we also need to know that when a regime is more deteriorable, more uncertain it is, and certainly now the decision making is circled around Xi Jinping itself and his close circle. And we saw the after 20th Party Congress, basically all the Xi Jinping's close allies has been promoted to the standing committee of the Party Bureau, and also members for the new Central Military Commission are also familiar with regional security, who had past experience working in dealing with Taiwan. So certainly this also sent a very dangerous signal from outside. So yesterday, there's another event in Taipei, Taiwan Dialogue. I don't know if you heard about that. The chairman, the president of the INDS, our defense think tank, he actually say, right now it's not about if China or this China want to initiate a war over Taiwan's trade. It's more about when it will do so. So our assessment is quite ominous. I think certainly under Xi Jinping's China, it would need some kind of justification to persuade the public, Chinese public, why he needs this certain and why he is different from the leader after Deng Xiaoping so far. And this is certainly a very dangerous signal to the region. Now, this doesn't say that for the peace in the region is impossible, it's hopeless. There's a still possibility, as Dr. Davis mentioned about the domestic issue in China. Well, you probably heard about the laying flag movement in China. China's younger generation, they are getting more and more cynical and political sensitive. So I think there's a possibility, the general public who still have a slightly different view from Xi Jinping. Also, we know the housing real estate crisis, the zero COVID policy, the economy slowdown. And certainly, I think, everyone has been paying attention on the 20th Party Congress to see if Xi Jinping proposed any kind of timetable to, as he says, to reunify Taiwan. And it was not proclaimed, loudly, certainly, because there's always a political risk. Chinese Communist Party, if it proclaims something, if it cannot deliver it, and that would backfire. And this will be certainly something we should pay attention on in the future. I'll stop here. That's just my personal perspective.
I actually agree with both of you. Just to add on to one more thing is, looking at the escalations that we're talking about, scholars usually say that dissuasion was the policy to follow, but then dissuasion will not be working at a point where China, if they think that, they feel the need to act, then it almost becomes undeterrable. No matter how many weapons we have in place, if they act, then it just becomes undeterrable. So considering that, what was said, like, Xi just becoming a dangerous figure for not just China, for not just Taiwan, but also the world, is the rightful analysis that we're going to, I think.
Thank you for that. Your point about Xi becoming undeterrable because he would perhaps have to act, I think that ties in interestingly with the previous point about domestic concerns in China and what could compel that. In light of that, what do you make of the recent zero COVID policy, the technological competition with the United States that recently kicked into overdrive, and what that means for China's long-term economic conditions? And could Xi be in a position where he has to take Taiwan on a particular timeline because of the need to lash out for those domestic concerns? And are we making that more likely by stressing the economy? Are we basically pushing ourselves towards conflict that could otherwise be perhaps delayed longer were it not for exacerbated economic conditions? Any of you that want to interact with that would be great.
Well, I'll quickly cut in, not to answer all of your question, but probably pointing out something. To be able to deter someone, you need to follow its own social law, its own logic. So we've been talking about deterrence from the Western perspective. We do cause-effect calculation, thinking about presenting force. We will change your perception and you do something differently. So this also go back in the beginning, talking about the recent semiconductor competition. Is it some kind of deterrence? I think that deterrence work in the way from the Western conception. And if you want to have a successful deterrence, you need to put yourself in the position of Xi Jinping, what he concerned more, what he concerned most. So the logic for deterrence will be different. So now, certainly I'm not Xi Jinping. I'm saying that from traditional Chinese Communist Party's logic, is survival. Legitimacy is always something that's most important. That's why I mentioned about we need to do some kind of surgical information operation or acupuncture information operation, because China is exploiting when we are pointing finger at China as whole, except not CCP as it precisely. Then Xi Jinping could use this to reframe it, saying that it's external interference and to feel its political legitimacy. So I don't know if you got what I'm saying here. So the deterrence would be not just from your own rationality, your own logic. You need to put yourself in Xi Jinping's position. Now, in terms of its political legitimacy, at a certain point, you need to do the calculation. Which one is more important? Is it the domestic issue more important? So-called Taiwan question more important, or the competition with the US more important? And this is something that you should do it from the, I won't say Chinese rationality, or Xi Jinping's rationality. And certainly that will be distinct. And then, so there's still possibility to deter Xi Jinping if we find the right perspective. And we just need to be careful. We couldn't look at these things from our perspective or external perspective. That would be something I want to say. So to answer your question, first question indirectly, is this going to be working in terms of the putting on the section on the semiconductor? I think for the long term, it's going to be negative because since Xi Jinping, well, if he's still controlling China, will always figure out a way to develop its own version of the semiconductor. So for the long term, it's going to be deliver another kind of challenge. But for the long term, it actually creates economic impact. And it actually, attack is the economic legitimacy tool, as I say. And so after 20th Party Congress, we can observe his narrative is becoming more and more ideological, and he is looking for some kind of the, I don't know, blessing from Mao Zedong. So if from the news you can see he tried to echo a lot of rhetorics. So I'll stop here. So I hope my perspective helped everyone.
Yeah, look, I think that we also need to remember that from Xi's perspective, sitting there in Zhongnanhai, that it's not just about Taiwan. He has broader ambitions beyond Taiwan in terms of making China the dominant power on the planet, and certainly the dominant power in the Indo-Pacific region, ending US strategic primacy in the Indo-Pacific region, essentially establishing a community of common destiny that is led by China from Beijing. And so the whole issue of technology and the semiconductors and so forth, and it's just other areas such as artificial intelligence and so forth, really critical for China to achieve its bigger grand strategic ambitions beyond Taiwan. And so I think Dr. Yao is correct that we've taken this step because we see China as the pacing threat. that is the one state that can challenge US strategic interests across the length and breadth of statecraft. But the Chinese will find a way to circumvent it and develop their own capabilities. If they take Taiwan, they're not going to get Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company. That's going to be in bits and pieces. Okay, so they won't get that, but they will find a way to develop their own technologies because it's in their critical interest to do so. If they don't have the leadership position in those critical and emerging technology areas in the 21st century, they're not going to be the dominant power on the planet. Okay, and that's ironically where the domestic challenges could actually undermine China's goals, grand strategic ambitions. If they can't get on top of these domestic economic and social challenges, then it all starts to fall apart at some point in the next few years.
Well, I actually agree with them because the US ban on semiconductors was, you can just look at it as creating choke points. You have to remind and create those necessary deterrent choke points as and when necessary. So it almost seems like if the shift in US policy is that if they can't hold the competitors' capabilities, and if they can't compete in that, they're just degrading the competitors' capability by putting a ban in and giving them less access to quality and all of that. So it just feels like that. But I just feel that, like said before, that Chinese characteristics has a very distinctive nature to what has been looked at the West and how the West reads China has, and considering that Xi's grand plan that he has to be understood from Xi's lens, like was mentioned before. Otherwise, then there's a big, otherwise the whole deterrence has failed right then and there.
Thank you for that. So in terms of expected time, I'm comfortable going for another hour. Are you guys working with that? Does that work for you? Or do you have hard outs that you need to be out by?
Look, I can go through to 1 o'clock my time.
What time is it now, your time?
It's 11:34.
Okay, all right, fantastic. We got some time to work with.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, let's keep the dialogue going on. I think it's important. Good to learn from you guys. Yeah.
Okay.
That's great. That's good.
I agree with the panelists. I'm loving the discussions. I'm learning a lot too.
Fantastic. Okay. So I want to follow up a little bit more on these domestic concerns and these broader strategic aims that Xi has and how they're currently being threatened. Just to clarify with you guys, because it seems like there's a couple of different possible ways that this could go. If Xi is threatened by and his political legitimacy from the economic tool, as Dr. Yao described, if that's undermined before an invasion happens and Xi is in a more precarious situation, does that mean to him, don't go or don't go now because I've got too much on my plate? Or does that mean use the ideological tool that Dr. Yao talks about from the 20th Congress to kind of do a diversionary war with the US coalition over Taiwan to kind of distract from the bottom falling out of the Chinese economy and problems like that? And then what kind of resistance, if you were to do something like that, what kind of resistance could we expect from Chinese society, from the other party members and the like, especially given the somewhat muted response we've seen so far to China's zero COVID policy? Like what would be the expected result from something like that? Which way do you think you'll go, and what do you think that would mean?
Well, I mean, first point is that it's not just about what happens in China. Also, it's what happens in the United States as well. We've got a very divisive political situation emerging in the United States going up to the 2024 election, the potential for civil unrest, even violence re-emerging like what happened on January 6th. So, you know, there is that real risk that maybe the US won't be there. Maybe the US will be turning inwards and having its own problems, in which case, if we're talking about domestic problems in China starting to creep up on Xi, he's more likely to go and do the attack on Taiwan if he doesn't think the US is going to be there. If he thinks he can do basically take Taiwan and the US won't respond because it's got its hands full internally or because it's bogged down in Europe dealing with the Russians, then he's more likely to sort of say, yes, we're going in 2027. If it gets to 2027 and the US is unified, we're past the problems and the US has got its eyes on the ball in terms of what's happening in the Indo-Pacific region, and he's got these domestic challenges in China, it's conceivable that he could push it back. But the risk, if he pushes it back, is that the correlation of forces across the strait and between the US and China get worse for China, not better. You know, the US starts to sort of develop some of the capabilities they're going to need to defeat China. You know, the US allies are better prepared, so Australia and Japan and others are better prepared. We've started to get some of our capabilities that we need together. So it actually becomes more costly for him to do it later than it does in 2027. Yeah, so I think that unless there's some real internal unrest in China that's actually posing a threat to Xi's grip on power, any domestic challenges within China would more than likely mean that he would go in the second half of this decade rather than delaying it into the 2030s. And certainly I think that the notion of, oh, this has to be done by 2049 is nonsensical now. You know, I think at the very latest, it's going to be the early 2030s.
Yeah, I think I agree with Dr. Davis in the sense that I don't think there's any kind of policy that will be like time capsule, you know, that stay like that forever, even for authoritarian regime like Xi Jinping. So he is constantly, you know, waiting. You know, he's doing his calculation about the domestic and external. And likewise, I know Dr. Davis talked about the U.S. situation, but I would like to talk about the, you know, Taiwan situation. Certainly, we observe, you know, PLA has been using the traditional means, military exercise around Taiwan's trade. As I say, they are spreading threat, although not actually doing the actual attack. So this is another kind of hybrid warfare. We've been talking about hybrid warfare using the non-traditional means to do the, you know, traditional end, but this is using the traditional means to fulfill, to conduct it during the peacetime and to create some kind of untraditional end, even to create more turbulence within Taiwan. And I want to emphasize that, you know, China right now, his strategy is attacking Taiwan's strategy, alliance, and society, because the center of the gravity for Taiwan obviously is the society by itself. So when he perceives, you know, Taiwan's strategic alliance and militaries are weak, then it will be very likely the cross-strait is in danger. But likewise, for China, even though it's an authoritarian regime, but we have been able to observe, you know, in recent years, public opinions also matters to Xi. You probably heard news, there was some kind of, you know, mob or gangster, you know, fighting, you know, there was attacking some girls in China, somewhere city, in Tanshan. And the event forced Chinese Communist Party to react. So I think this is a point I want to say. For Xi Jinping, certainly, he needs to constantly, you know, weighting all these different factors and decide what is more important. And it's certainly hard to predict, you know, what could happen. But what we need to do right now, we should continue to change its perception. As I say, Taiwan continue to enhance our defense. harden our mental defense and the military defense. But we also need the regional support, because by having partners in the Indo-Pacific to contribute a little bit into this overall Xi Jinping's calculation, we should be able to change his perception. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
To answer the question, it would be rational that don't act would be a rational choice to do, because considering the amount of things he has to deal with domestically and
Please unmute
externally.
yourself.
Yeah, sorry,
Okay.
we can hear you earlier. So yeah,
Okay.
I think
So
yeah, continue.
okay. So it would be the rational choice to do, which is don't act. But then, like said, that considering that there is ambiguity in whether US is going to be supporting or US is going to come in, and the perceptions of image that if US is not, then Taiwan will be weak. So it's easier for China to invade Taiwan at this point. Those are risky assumptions to make at this point, I feel. That and that's the reason that it should be rational for China not to act, and it would be expensive if they do so.
So if we were to develop a more explicit commitment for a coalition to go for it, like you said, Dr. Davis, Australia seems ready to go if the United States goes. Japan seems willing to go as well in the event that the United States goes. If we were to, move away from strategic ambiguity towards strategic clarity and develop that kind of very public coalition, what could that mean for trying to then end the war on the other side if we still end up in a war anyway and deterrence fails? Because like you were noting earlier, Mr. Jaya, we've got, if you have a coalition, you have partners with differing interests, conflicting interests perhaps. And just looking at the war in Ukraine now, I mean, the United States hasn't suffered a single casualty, and yet we're still not interested in negotiating. And you have sunk costs and all of that along the way. How could you ever get to a point where the conflict ends, or would this just end up being a frozen conflict without a negotiated settlement? Thinking both from the need for China to have something that would be appropriate for a settlement, and then also resolving tensions and conflicting interests within the U.S. coalition. What would that look like? What would those conflicting interests and factors be for trying to find a way to end this without it crossing the nuclear threshold or going on indefinitely?
Well, I don't think the West has a theory of victory. That's part of the problem. That's one of the things we do need to think about is how do we end the war? And we don't have one. We've kind of made the assumption that somehow the Chinese do invade Taiwan, we'll enter into it. We'll have to defeat their anti-access air denial capabilities. We'll take losses in the process, and then somehow we'll force the Chinese off Taiwan. And there's been talk of doing some sort of amphibious landing and sort of trying to retake Taiwan that way. Incredibly costly in lives. I mean, it'd be worse than D-Day in Normandy. And there's no way that we could resupply Taiwan during the war like we're doing with Ukraine, because there's no common land border, and trying to get supplies into Taiwan through Chinese anti-access and air denial would just be losing ships left, right, and center. So I don't think we do have a theory of victory. I don't think we have an end state for the war in mind on our side. Conversely, the Chinese do have a theory of victory. Their theory of victory is that they take and hold Taiwan, they occupy it, they subdue its population. We had the Chinese ambassador to Australia a few months back giving a speech at the National Press Club, where he said that the Taiwanese population will need to be re-educated. Everyone understands what that means. It means concentration camps. So that's the sort of thing that the Chinese are envisaging. And from having secured Taiwan, they then pivot north and they pressure Japan through the Ryukyus, or they project power out in the Central Pacific towards Guam, or they pivot south and basically impose their will on Southeast Asia and even further into the South Pacific and Australia. In 2020, they gave us a list of 14 grievances, which they expected us to accept, 14 demands, which would have ended our sovereignty and made us basically a vassal state to China. So that's their theory of victory. They want to be the dominant hegemon in the Indo-Pacific region. We don't have a theory of victory. So that's something that I think that we need to think about, because the alternatives are, as I said, either protracted war that goes on and the casualties mount up and there's no clear winner, or we escalate across the nuclear threshold and there's no clear winner. So, not good outcomes either way, but to do nothing, to essentially stand back whilst the Chinese re-educate the 23 million Taiwanese people, I think is unacceptable either from an ethical and moral standard, just as it is unacceptable to do nothing to help the Ukrainians now against the Russians.
Yeah, I think I'll continue what Dr. Davis has been saying. Number one, I think when Chinese Communist Party saying that re-educating Taiwanese people, they are channeling this message to domestic audience, because certainly that's what I'm saying. They are using this ideological tool to creating some kind of rally around the flag. Certainly, this is not very pleasant message to anyone in Taiwan, and they certainly understand that. But for them, it's more important for them to get support, domestically, than thinking about what people in Taiwan will think. So that's why I say, we need to put ourselves in, CCP's shoes and to understand their perspective. And the second thing is about, the coalition, the support, or the winning formula. Well, this is my thought. I think the reason there's no negotiation during Russo-Ukrainian war is because when you deal with an authoritarian regime, once the war occurs, you won't be able to get them to agree something until the result match up with their victorial narrative they established in the beginning. So for Russo-Ukrainian war, either you prevent it in the first place, or as Dr. Davis mentioned, now it's become a prolonged war. It's probably going to last until Russia fails. And likewise, if unfortunately my observation is right, for the future Taiwan Strait contingency, either we do something now, we do something for sure to change Xi Jinping's perception, to convince him to change his calculus and to prevent war. Or once the war occurs, it's going to be an ugly picture. Hopefully it's going to be a prolonged war from Taiwanese side. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Well, I actually agree with both my panelists here. Even though the signaling from the allies have remained limited in the context of engagement, if in case of an all-out war, no one would want a devastating hot conflict in their region. And it was in that interest, at least, to that convergence at least will build up for the allies in the region in recognizing China as an adversary, even for the US, like mentioned by Dr. Davis, that operating from US or Guam is going to be extremely difficult without basing access. So that's going to, create extremely difficult situations for them to manage the entire war from these naval bases and faraway bases, and not have immediate procurement access. That's going to make it all the more difficult for US, while China definitely, like said, has a theory for victory. So, like said, that this is not the ideal time, at least, considering that these difficult questions has to be deliberated before going into a situation of a war.
Yeah, I would add into that, just recently, last few days, actually, here in Australia, there's been a lot of media interest in the decision by the US to deploy B-52s into Northern Australia at a place called RAAF Tyndall, where they're establishing a dedicated facilities to support up to 6 B-52s. And I think that is sort of like indicative of a broader issue where Australia becomes a key base to operate from in a protracted war against China. So it's not just B-52s, it could be US Navy, nuclear submarines and naval service combatants, certainly ground forces. And in the same way in World War II, that Australia was a key base, in the next war, we will be a key base. So that's causing a lot of media interest in terms of, it's Australia taking a fundamental step in its defense policy in response to the growing challenge from China. That's what's driving it, okay? And the same with AUKUS, for example, in 2021. We wouldn't have AUKUS if it were not for Xi Jinping. So many thanks to Xi for giving us this, because it's sort of like his approach to foreign policy, his approach to Taiwan, the Wolf Warrior diplomacy, all of that has made things like AUKUS possible. So that's indicative of the change that we're seeing.
Well, and if it seems like there is no easy resolution, or frankly, no possible resolution to Dr. Indu, do you have a question you want to bring?
I just, I'm curious about the Australian policy, and my question directly goes to Dr. Davis. So, because like when the former Prime Minister Scott Morrison was there, like he was a bit provocative than the new Prime Minister Albanese. And I wonder, like, the Australia is the nearshore partner to the Pacific and Oceania rather than the United States. So, or has Australia has some kind of different dimension than the US to deal with that China's problem or the China's expansionism or aggressive behavior, where I see that the Australia is closer in culture, in historically to the Pacific Islands, like when we talk about Solomon Island, like China's interference in those islands. So Australia has a better access to reach there than the United States. Like, what's your comment on this?
Yeah, we are, I think, waking up to the implications and the importance of the Southwest Pacific, particularly given that the Chinese are making very aggressive moves there to try and expand their influence. Solomon Islands is just the tip of the spear in that sense. They've signed an agreement with the Solomon Islands government that will give them the right to establish essentially a military base with PLA personnel onshore. That was a huge strategic shock to us in the lead up to the last election, the election which obviously the previous government lost. I do think the current government is pretty much similar to the previous government in its approach to China. There's been some attempts to sort of have a better relationship, but really they haven't borne fruit. I mentioned earlier the list of 14 grievances or 14 demands they gave us in 2020. Well, shortly after the election, they gave us another list of 4 demands. And that kind of like threw a wet blanket over any reset in the relationship. So I think the Chinese just don't get it in terms of understanding modern diplomacy and modern statecraft. They still think in 19th century terms, in terms of the Middle Kingdom. But to get to your point about the Southwest Pacific, we do have a greater responsibility there as the neighbor to the Southwest Pacific states. We are trying to reinforce our position and our ability to work with those states. Those states have very different security perspectives to us. We are focused very much on China. They are focused on climate change and the fact that their island states could be underwater as a result of climate change. And so they don't see the China issue as in the same way. And China comes in to these small states with literally suitcases full of money and does elite capture. They make it part of the Belt and Road Initiative, investing massive amounts of money in these small states. And then when these states can't pay back the debt, they basically take a port or an airport. So I do think that it is a real worry, in particular because what you could see is China eventually establishing certainly a military base in Solomon Islands, potentially elsewhere. We're watching Chinese activities in Papua New Guinea very closely. What we don't want to see is essentially a Chinese military presence a mere 2,000 kilometers off our eastern seaboard. or even closer if they get into Papua New Guinea, that would fundamentally shift our strategic calculus, and suddenly we're having to worry about direct attacks on our cities in a wartime situation. So, we are doing our best in that regard, diplomatically, economically, and also in terms of providing security assistance. But it is an emerging situation which is causing us a good deal of concern.
Thanks. Thank you. Edmund, you go ahead, please, with your question.
Sure thing. So in light of what's been said about this being a protracted war, and that there really doesn't seem to be the option of negotiating for a relatively quick end to the conflict, and it seems that our strategic planning should just be based on the assumption that that's what the war is going to be. In light of that, I have some questions about how Taiwan's defense should be framed, and what would be considered priority targets for the coalition at the outset of the conflict. Would things like China's own semiconductor factories and their shipyards be considered early targets to prevent, to try to reduce their ability to keep rebuilding after the conflict? And then for Taiwan itself, are there civil society expansions that are not directly military, such as perhaps adding nuclear power to the grid, or building up food supplies and the like, that would allow Taiwan to delay the onslaught of the invasion in a capacity that would permit coalition forces to take a little more, not leisurely, but a slower pace in moving past the area access, area denial systems to lower their attrition rate? Could steps like that shift the long-term balance of the attrition in US and coalition favor? And I ask that because, going back to Dr. Davis's point at the beginning about the CSIS war games, it appears that the United States, in the opening weeks of this conflict, suffers more casualties than the Russians have in the entire Ukraine conflict so far. And that's been a casualty ratio that's been almost unprecedented, except for the world wars. So just thinking in terms of the long-term attrition, ability to keep this up, what kinds of shifts would be necessary for targeting and for building up Taiwan's own defenses that could shift the long-term balance of the conflict in coalition favor? What would that look like?
Well, I guess I should answer this question first. Well, I just want to be clear, because I think we are talking about two scenarios. One is, try to change Xi Jinping's perception to deter its invasion. And second one, once unfortunately the war occurred, what's the strategy? What should we do? And I think your current question is more related to the second one, right? Although the second one can change its calculation when you initiate the war.
Yeah, I wanted to follow up. Yeah, I wanted to follow up afterwards and ask, if this is done, if Taiwan gets into a position that allows for a better long-term balance, would that change Xi Jinping's perception? So yeah, the two questions are very related. Yeah.
And I want to tell you that actually after Russia-Ukrainian war right now, we are very concerned about our supply chain. What I'm talking about supply chain, we'll be talking about Taiwan as an island. We take energy, we take food, from outside resources. So we have increased, we call it, strategic, the quota of the strategic stockpile. And our Minister of Economic Affairs actually make it public. We are actually doing that. We increase the capacity, making sure we will be able to sustain for a longer conflict. And the situation in Ukraine is Ukraine certainly has a very harsh winter, and Taiwan doesn't. And also during the war, all the civilian activity will be put into hold. So the energy consumption was not, you shouldn't expect it in the original, in the current quantity. So that is, already within government's plan. And also our civil defense agency are also checking all the bunker, the number of the shelters, making sure it has the sufficient capacity. There is something that we do every year, probably not on international news. Every year we have the civil defense exercise. We ask everyone to take shelter, to know where they can find the shelter, where they should do, what they should do during the conflict. So these all have been, when things are done quietly, they cannot change Xi Jinping's perception. That's a very important point. When this has been doing right quietly, like you do hardening of the facility, you do, camouflage, they will not be able to change the perception of the other side. So I think we are actually doing all these things, but unfortunately, the reason that we're working properly is we don't make it public. Now, in terms of put the terminology we use in the supply chain, the bottleneck for Xi Jinping's war will be in its amphibious or triamphibious capability. I know you've been talking about CSI simulation, about the casualty, but for Xi Jinping, the political risk for him is if he couldn't win a quick and decisive war, the result, the process could backfire and undermine his political legitimacy. In addition, if PLA suffered extremely high amount of the casualty during this amphibious campaign or triamphibious campaign, that would also undermine its political legitimacy. So we are preparing for the conflict, not in a perspective of the winning the war, but in the perspective of not losing the war. So this is actually from Sun Tzu. And so if you pay attention to the news, Taiwan has been enhancing our long-range missile capacity. We have the capability already, but we are increasing the capacity, the numbers and quantity. And we make this public. You see this on news. Yeah, we want to make them be aware we are preparing something. And certainly Taiwan is small, but our military force would be diesel. That would be something I want to say here. Thank you.
Yeah, in terms of how could we sustain this? I do think that, and how could China sustain it? I do think that we have to think about the prospect of protracted war because it's becoming increasingly likely. And I think that Ukraine shows that high-intensity wars are invariably protracted, but they're incredibly costly in terms of the rates of use of weapons and munitions and so forth. So this is a fundamental problem for the West, I think more so than China, in the sense that we need to realign and reorganize our military technological production approach towards a wartime economy that can sustain high-intensity operations over months or longer. The Chinese, I think, on the surface at least, have that already. They've got shipyards where they're building 8 Type 55 Renhai class cruisers simultaneously. By contrast, Australia has taken 10 years to build 3 ships. So, it's that sort of, we need to somehow change our military industrial capacity in anticipation of protracted war, because the alternatives are either we run out of munitions very quickly and we're defeated, or we go across the nuclear threshold and then no one wins. So, if we want to avoid nuclear war, if we want to avoid a Chinese hegemony, then somehow we need to address this issue of our military industrial capacity. But once again, that then gets us back to what is our theory of victory at the end of the day? Even if we can sustain this war for months, how do we bring it to an end? And I don't have an answer for that. I don't think anyone else does.
Well, I actually agree with my panelists here because sustaining for Taiwan, like I said, it includes both military and non-military actions, and this was even highlighted by the panelists. It's not just the procurement of long-range missiles and exploring options for naval mining and creating space for airships and asymmetrical warfare, but it's also using trade and investment and infrastructure to not only keep the defense grid sustained, but also to keep your population sustained. So it's going to be a long sustainment policy, and there are a lot of gaps that needs to be addressed, like I said.
So then if we're realigning for this long-term conflict, and Taiwan is making these changes, and let's say hypothetically, Dr. Davis, that the United States and its coalition partners do change their procurement strategies and rebuild the industrial base to a more wartime footing, and these gaps get plugged. Dr. Yao, this is probably the best question to begin with you. Would that kind of demonstration of preparedness for conflict on the part, not just of Taiwan, but the entire coalition, would that be, in terms of Xi Jinping's logic, would that be more of a credible deterrent that could prevent him from trying to take Taiwan, even within the time frame that we're talking about, 2024 to 2027? Or what other factors specific to him, besides just military preparedness and Taiwan being able to go the distance, would factor in to something like that? Like, how would these kinds of preparations work for deterrence to avoid what looks like it would be a hopelessly long conflict?
Okay, thank you, Emma. I think the conventional scholarly critique to that approach would like saying is escalation is going to create a security dilemma. But I will disagree with that argument, because the problem is because China is doing its expansionist agenda. So security dilemma only happen that both of them have the intention to maintain the regional stability. But now, because China is different, is doing the expansion, the agenda. So certainly, what you are suggesting would change China's perception in terms of increase its, coalition allies, defense capability. But I also want to point out, this would also about Taiwan. Given that we understand Taiwan is island, and Dr. Davis mentioned about Taiwan would not be able to receive, or would be really challenging to receive any kind of war supply during the war, the conflict. So I think it's also worthwhile for allies to think about to support Taiwan's indigenous defense capacity and to increase it. So that would help Taiwan to sustain its defense for longer. So I think this should work on both ways, not just from outside, but also for Taiwan itself. And I guess this would be like, talking about the change perception, change its calculation. So I think certainly what we are talking here will certainly, make a difference in terms of, Xi Jinping's perception. But eventually, you also need to think about, what's the Taiwan's capacity, and that is also very encouraging. And I think from the news media, there are already some talking about, setting up some kind of defense cooperation, industrial cooperation, and to enhance Taiwan capacity. I see it's a positive development. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. Dr. Davis, do you have anything to add, or Ms. Bajai, do you have anything to add here?
Look, I agree with Dr. Yao. I think it's getting to the point whereby we do need to start supporting Taiwan in terms of not only diplomatic engagement, much broader, free trade areas, that sort of thing, but also with military assistance, so that they are better prepared to fend off a Chinese invasion. As I said earlier in this session, there's no way we're going to get supplies to them during the conflict. So therefore, it's better to do it now and strengthen their ability to resist. And they need to have the right types of capabilities. And I don't want to get down into the technical weeds of platforms per se, but I think sort of asymmetric capabilities that can raise the costs for the Chinese in trying to get forces across the strait are a clear approach that we could take in providing that to the Taiwanese, so that the Chinese are then confronted with the prospect that if they are going to use force against Taiwan, they're going to pay a very heavy price. And I think it gets back to the point earlier that is that in Xi's interest, or might he think twice at that point? So once again, it's about deterrence. It's about strengthening the ability for Taiwan, for the US, for Australia, for Japan, all to work together to make Xi think twice and change his cost benefit calculus so that in the end he chooses, actually, I'm not going to do this. Now then he faces the problem, of course, politically and domestically, of how does he sell that to the Chinese people if he's not going to take Taiwan, particularly if Taiwan is being seen to, slip further and further away. That's his problem. Our problem is to deter, sort of him from doing a rather stupid thing and launching an attack on Taiwan.
In addition, it's not just an all-out war that we have to deter. There are also many intermediate actions like a blockade or a seizure of islands between China and Taiwan, or cyber harassment. These intermediate actions also need consolidated deterrence, as a way to go forward.
For that, those contributions. Dr. Davis, you just mentioned about Xi we want to make it so it's challenging for Xi to justify an invasion, and even in his own mind, given the cost that would come. You mentioned as well, how would he then sell it domestically? And Dr. Yao, you mentioned before about a targeted information operation. And Mr. Jai, you talk about deterrence and how we need a more comprehensive understanding of what deterrence would be. I'm wondering, what kinds of things could we do while strengthening, the hard deterrence side of things? What could we do on the information side of things, perhaps, or the economic side, maybe, that would make it easier for Xi Jinping to step down? Or not step down, sorry, not step down power, but step back from the brink, so to speak, and make that more politically palatable and less politically costly for him? How do you change the correlation of the cost and benefit side, not just by raising the cost, but by raising perhaps the benefits, making it easier for him to step back? Do any of you have any ideas on that? And Dr. Yao, with your information, surgical information operation would there play a part in that?
So you are talking about, things we can do other than, the hard military side, the hard kill side, the conventional military side. There's anything else that we can do? So certainly, I think we should be clear about our message. The competition right now is about the democracy and autocracy, and we are against Xi Jinping's authoritarian style of the leadership. And this is certainly something we need to be precise. In the English language, or in this context, China is referred to the Chinese Communist Party. But when we are writing it in Chinese, we'll be very careful. The Chinese language is actually, differentiate the Chinese Communist Party and China itself. And I think this was more like noticed by the Western media for the past few years, and I'll encourage we should continue to do that. And economically, certainly, I think Xi Jinping is trying to turn to the ideological tool as a substitute for its underperformance of the economics. And this is certainly something we need to pay attention. That means that economy still matters to the general public, because for Russia-Ukrainian war, or maybe, a lot of people around the world are concerned more about the price of the food, the price of the oil, but they probably don't know too much about Taiwan, because it's a natural choice. The price of food and oil matter them more. Likewise, I believe the reason Chinese Communist Party was able to sustain its political legitimacy was they was able to reorient the narrative of the economic development. They always say that it's because of the Chinese Communist Party's leadership. So the Chinese people, stand again. But when they play this nationalist narrative in too much, you also present a danger. And I think we are in that moment. They've been playing that nationalist narrative too much. So Dr. Davis mentioned about, we've been talking about Taiwan, but I don't think Taiwan is the end, the final objective of the Xi Jinping's regime. Is looking for the global ambition, and that's been proclaimed by China itself. So certainly, economically, it's going to undermine its legitimacy. But we just need to do do it in a more skillful way, because although majority, well, a huge portion of the Chinese economy is state-owned enterprises, but they are still, pure private sectors. So like if we pay attention to China's domestic economy, Alibaba's past CEO Mao Yun, he seems to be quiet and obviously stand on the wrong side of the party. So from my perspective, I sense there is still certain level of resistance or moderate voice within the Chinese population. And we should find a way to encourage them, to support them, to create some kind of indirect constraint. And I think this is possible, by economic pressure. We need to be careful depending on how you do it, because the sanction normally would affect the general public, but not the political elite. So targeting sanction is a good way. And I think we see more trends we are doing now. And the last thing, I think right now, originally we say, the world is flat, and we were enjoying the advantage of the comparative advantage, like, everyone contribute what they are good at. Now we see there's a complementary advantage, nation and state find a partner that feel more comfortable to do so. By continuing that trend, I am certain that Taiwan certainly, we have a democratic value. We will be able to contribute to this kind of democratic, the same democratic value. And likewise, for Chinese Communist Party, eventually you look for the Belt and Road Initiative country to create a different order. And I have no resolution for how to deal with such kind of fragmentation for the economic order, but it's certainly something we need to pay attention on. Well, that's all I can say in terms of the economic sector. The information domain, certainly I've said a lot already. We need to be accurate. We need to be precise. That would be something the cautious note I would say. Thank you.
Yeah, I would add that, Taiwan, I think, as a country, represents the alternative path for China, in the sense that you have a vibrant young democracy with a strong, growing economy, where people are free to express their views. They don't get threatened by the state if they challenge government perspectives. Freedom of press, freedom of thought, no sort of social credit system or anything like that, no mass surveillance. So it's a liberal democracy in that also combines Chinese characteristics, okay? That's an anathema to Xi Jinping, because it challenges everything that he wants, which is absolute control and absolute power for himself and for the Chinese Communist Party. So if you wanted to basically undertake an information campaign that would somehow weaken his grip on power, what you need to do is get across to the Chinese people that there is an alternative path for them. Yeah. They can actually choose reform. They can choose the path that they stopped taking in Tiananmen Square and after Tiananmen Square, and they can go back onto that. And really, China, if it went down the path of democratic reform, could be a hugely important partner for Western countries. Together between the US and China, we could achieve so much in terms of things like climate change, in terms of international terrorism and poverty and healthcare and so forth. We have that opportunity. That path is still there for them, but the Chinese people have to force Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party to take that path, and the challenge is getting them to do that. And if their information space is closed off to that possibility because they never get to see what happens outside because of Chinese firewalls and so forth, then they're never going to be aware of that. But you do have Chinese tourists coming into Taiwan all the time, so getting them to understand that, and loads of Chinese tourists here in Australia, getting them to understand that they don't have to go down this dark authoritarian Orwellian path is, I think, something that really we should be thinking about how we do that. in an information campaign and communicating that to the Chinese people directly, bypassing the state and just going straight to the Chinese people. Of course, the Chinese wouldn't like that. They would see that as an interference in their internal affairs. But what we're trying to do is avoid ending up in a massive war that could lead to a nuclear war. We're trying to actually create a human society that lasts centuries into the future and can progress. So how do we do that? We work together.
I actually have nothing to add because I think both my panelists have covered a wide range and have covered most of all that had to be said about it. Maybe just one point would be that, Dr. Davis actually mentioned this amazing point of, bypassing the state. I mean, of course, they wouldn't like it, but then if we could bypass and go to the public. But there were also reports, of fissures within the party. If the West can capitalize on those fissures, then maybe the information targeting campaign would be a little more effective. If capitalizing on the fissures within the party itself, such a huge party that it is.
Okay, so targeting more to the parties and not to the party officials outside of Xi and not just to the people. Okay, interesting point on that. So that concludes my questions. I want to leave some time here at the end before we have to get out for each of you to make some concluding remarks or re-emphasize something that you want to bring back to the center of attention. Dr. Yao, considering that it's you're the one that's most closely directly affected by the subject, I'd like to leave you the last spot to close everything out. Would either one of the panelists like to begin?
Yeah. So I'll be the last one, right?
Yeah. I'd like to let you close out the whole conversation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you represent Taiwan, so.
I'll let Paulina go first, I think.
I just, in concluding remarks, I just had to say, that deepening, as discussed, the deepening of ties between US, Taiwan, and the allies multilaterally will help isolate China and will further only increase in political, economic, and other ties will help stop, well short of at least a direct war, if not at least help deter the intermediate actions. So Taiwan, there are also other ways to signal that Taiwan is a valuable member of the democratic community. And enhancing deterrent through non-military will further converge the interests of all the parties involved. So as I said, the bottom line in the presentation is to keep the deterrence focused on China and to bring those the difficult conversations on interest, expectations, and capacity back into question. Thank you.
Thank you.
I guess my thoughts are we don't have a lot of time. Time is not on our side here. We don't have decades to think about this. We've got maybe 5 years in worst case scenario. So we need to start putting our forces in preparation. We need to start developing our policies to try and deter. We need to do that really quickly. We need to shift to a pre-war period mindset in terms of our approach to strategic policy. And when you look at what's happening in Europe with Ukraine and potential for escalation in other areas and now China, Taiwan, I do think we need to think about potential worst case scenarios of where this goes. And if it happens, how do we then win? And I'm not sure that we've really thought that through because we've gotten used to assuming that this sort of thing would never happen. I think after the Cold War and certainly during the War on Terror, we assumed that major power war was never going to happen again. Well, Ukraine, I think, demonstrated that it will happen, and now we're facing the same prospect with Taiwan. So we need to get ready for that. We need to start thinking about military capability, having that in place to deter, to raise the costs for the Chinese to do anything. we need to be also thinking about information operations and how to try and dissuade China from acting. And that could be about bypassing the Chinese government and going straight to the Chinese people and convincing them that actually, if China wants to be a global great power, then maybe the mark of greatness is to have the courage to give the Taiwanese people the freedom to choose their own path in the future, for the future, rather than imposing China's path upon them. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Davis and Ms. Mijaya and Emma and Dr. Indu. Well, what I want to say is continue the point raised by Dr. Davis. Although China has the diplomatic relationships with many different countries, but China is not security partner of many different countries as well. And likewise for Taiwan, although Taiwan hasn't established a lot of diplomatic relationships with many different countries, but Taiwan could be your security partner. The other point I want to mention is China now is different from China before. CCP under Xi Jinping's rule is different from CCP under Hu Jintao, Jiang Zemin, or Deng Xiaoping. And the history tells us a lot. During World War II, while European power, they wrongly believed that appeasement could maintain peace for Europe. But Hitler was so determined to initiate a conflict right from the beginning of the negotiation in the Munich Agreement. During Korean War, when the US, prior to the Korean War, when US Secretary of State Dean Acheson did not include South Korea in America's defense perimeter in Pacific, it was criticized by some for giving green light to North Korea's invasion. And likewise, I think we are in a critical moment. Xi Jinping's legitimacy in China comes from its self-imposed nationalist narrative. This CCP's dogma will naturally lead the country to engage with territorial issues, not only with Taiwan, but also in East China, South China Sea, Sino-India border, and or even around the world. On behalf of Taiwan, thanks for everyone for your interest in the regional security here, and I'll be looking forward for more fruitful dialogue in the future with the team, with you, and with every panelist here. Thank you. Back to you, Edmond.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Yao. This has been a very helpful, insightful panel, and I really appreciated getting to hear from all of you, and it's been a pleasure for me. And I suspect as well that those who go on to see this recording, to this conversation, will benefit and appreciate it. So I really thank you all for your time. Thank you for coming out here, especially given the crazy time zone differences that we're working with. So very much appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting us.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Thank you, Dr. Yao, Purnima. Thank you, Edmund. Yeah, it was difficult to manage the time. And when my final remarks, like direct confrontation and direct containment is not possible in this era. But definitely we need to think about the solution, like China's aggressive behavior or expansionism, and just make to clear that we want to win or we want to dissuade China not to establish the military bases. So that's also like what's China exploiting, how we can stop that. Thank you very much, and I'll stop the recording here.